The air in Hangar Bay 4 was thick enough to taste, a foul cocktail of burnt ozone, desperation, and the metallic tang of failure. It clung to the gray concrete floor and coiled around the silent, formidable shape of the F-16 Fighting Falcon, call sign Viper 7. For 72 agonizing hours, the jet had been grounded, a technological marvel rendered inert by a ghost in its own machine. A cascade of flight control errors had baffled the squadron's best and brightest, a new generation of maintenance technicians who worshipped at the altar of diagnostic tablets and digital schematics. They were young, sharp, and utterly lost. Their laptops and advanced sensor suites offered a dozen conflicting diagnoses, each one a dead end that led only to more frustration. The jet, a critical asset for an imminent overseas deployment, might as well have been $1 billion paperweight. Lieutenant Kyle Davies, the officer in charge of the maintenance crew, slammed a diagnostic tablet onto a tool cart with a frustrated crack. The screen spiderwebbed. He was 26, with a fresh engineering degree from a prestigious university and an ego to match. This Viper was his responsibility, and its stubborn refusal to cooperate was a personal affront, a stain on his immaculate record. His team, a collection of equally young airmen, mirrored his agitation, pacing uselessly around the inert fighter, their faces slick with sweat under the harsh fluorescent lights. It was into this crucible of impotent expertise that Alara Vance walked. She moved with a quiet economy that drew no attention, her worn work boots making soft sounds on the gritty floor. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe, practical bun, a style that emphasized the sharp intelligence in her piercing, observant eyes. At 30, she carried the subtle but unmistakable poise of a veteran, a certain stillness amidst chaos that life in the service drills into one's very bones. She was a civilian now, a contractor tasked with logistical support, and had only come to the hangar to sign a final batch of out-processing paperwork. It was supposed to be her last day on base, the final severing of a tie to a life she had once lived and breathed. She saw the tension immediately, felt it like a change in barometric pressure. She recognized the specific brand of helplessness that grips a crew when their machine refuses to yield its secrets. She saw the Viper, its canopy agape like a silent scream, and felt a familiar, unwelcome pang of connection. The simmering anger in the hangar needed a target, and her quiet, unassuming presence was a perfect one. Lieutenant Davies noticed her first. He saw her worn Carhartt jacket, the slight fading on her jeans, and the calm, almost analytical way she was looking at his problem. He saw a civilian, an outsider, and worse, a woman who looked more like a librarian than a mechanic. His frustration, curdled by pride, found its voice. "Can we help you, ma'am?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescending sweetness. The word ma'am was a deliberate jab, meant to age and diminish her. Several of his younger airmen snickered, turning to watch the show. Eli's gaze shifted from the jet to the lieutenant. She didn't rise to the bait. "Just finishing up some paperwork, Lieutenant. I heard you were having some trouble with Viper 7-inch. Her voice was low and even, carrying a hint of a rasp that spoke of long nights on flight lines and shouting over the roar of afterburners. The simple, knowledgeable statement seemed to rankle Davies even more. "Trouble?" he scoffed, throwing his hands up in mock exasperation. No trouble at all. We're just admiring the advanced, state-of-the-art diagnostic systems that can't figure out why this bird won't talk to us. It's a real marvel of modern engineering." He walked over to a massive toolbox, his movements jerky and theatrical. He picked up a heavy, grease-stained combination wrench, its steel gleaming dully. He strode back toward Eli and held it out to her, handle first. "Here," he said, his voice loud enough for the entire hangar to hear. "You look like you know your way around an antique. Maybe you can feel its humors, read its tea leaves. Give it a shot." It was a gesture of supreme contempt, a public humiliation. He wasn't just dismissing her, he was using her as a prop to vent his own failure. The wrench hung in the air between them, a grimy scepter of mockery. The snickers from the crew grew louder, echoing slightly in the cavernous space. For a moment, Eli just looked at the wrench, then at the young, arrogant face before her. A flicker of something ancient and weary passed through her eyes, a shadow of countless other moments of being underestimated, of being judged by a cover that revealed none of the story written inside. She could have turned and walked away. She could have signed her papers and left this nest of youthful pride to its own devices. But then her eyes drifted back to the F-16. It wasn't just a machine to her. It was a promise. A living thing of wire and metal that carried pilots into the sky. To leave it broken felt like leaving a comrade behind. With a slow, deliberate motion, she reached out and took the wrench from his hand. Her grip was firm, her fingers wrapping around the cold steel with an innate familiarity. "All right, Lieutenant," she said, her voice still impossibly calm. "I'll take a look." The laughter died in the throats of the young airmen, replaced by a confused, expectant silence. They had anticipated refusal, anger, or embarrassment. They had not anticipated quiet acceptance. Lieutenant Davies was momentarily thrown, his smirk faltering. He had expected her to scurry away, tail between her legs. Instead, she was walking toward the fighter jet, the heavy wrench held loosely at her side as if it were an extension of her own arm. Commander Wallace, the Wing Operations Group commander, was drawn from his office by the unusual silence from Hangar 4. For 3 days, the hangar had been a hive of noise, shouted commands, the clang of tools, the incessant, frustrated hum of diagnostic equipment. The sudden quiet was more alarming than the noise. He walked onto the command balcony overlooking the hangar floor, his stern gaze taking in the scene. He saw Davies and his crew standing in a loose, baffled clump. And he saw the woman. A civilian he didn't recognize, holding a wrench and approaching the most problematic aircraft on his base. His brow furrowed. "Lieutenant Davies!" His voice boomed over the hangar's intercom, sharp and laced with authority. "What is the meaning of this? Who is that civilian near the aircraft?" Davies snapped to attention, his face flushing. "Sir! That's… she's a contractor, Commander. Just offered to provide a fresh set of eyes." The lie was clumsy, and Wallace knew it. He had seen the mocking posture of the crew just moments before. He didn't respond, choosing instead to watch, his arms crossed over his chest. This was irregular, a breach of protocol, but the situation was already critical. Perhaps, he mused grimly, a miracle was in order. Down on the floor, Eli was oblivious to the commander on the balcony. She was in her own world now. The derisive stares of the crew faded into the periphery. There was only her, the machine, and the problem that lay hidden in its heart. She didn't climb into the cockpit or plug in a computer. Her approach was entirely different, something the tech-reliant crew had never witnessed. She started at the nose of the aircraft, placing a bare hand on the composite skin of the radome. She closed her eyes for a brief second, as if listening. She was feeling for the subtle resonance of the structure, for the memory of stress. The young airmen exchanged bewildered glances. "What is she doing?" one whispered. "Is she praying to it?" another murmured, barely suppressing a giggle. Davies just shook his head, a smug "I told you so" look returning to his face. This was better than he could have hoped. She wasn't just going to fail, she was going to look like a fool doing it. Eli ignored them. Her movements were a slow, methodical ballet of inspection. She ran her fingertips along the panel seams, her touch light but discerning. She knelt, her gaze tracing the complex web of hydraulic lines and electrical conduits inside the main landing gear bay. She wasn't looking for a single broken component, the way the younger crew had been. They had been taught to think in terms of modules, of black boxes to be swapped out. They saw the F-16 as a collection of parts. Eli saw it as a body, a complete and interconnected system where a tremor in one limb could be caused by a flaw in another, far-removed organ. Her hands, surprisingly deft and clean, moved over components coated in hydraulic fluid and grime. She didn't flinch. She pressed on a valve here, tapped a conduit there, her head tilted as she listened to the resulting sound, no matter how faint. To the onlookers, it was bizarre, esoteric. To Eli, it was a language. Every vibration, every harmonic dissonance, Every slight resistance in a moving part was a word, a sentence in the story of the aircraft's pain. She saw the new parts the crew had installed: a gleaming flight control computer, a fresh set of hydraulic actuators. They had been shotgunning the problem, replacing expensive components in the desperate hope of stumbling upon the solution. It was a wasteful, ignorant approach. It was like treating a nerve problem by amputating the limb. Eli knew the fault wasn't in the new parts. The fault was older, deeper. It was a flaw in the relationship between the parts, a subtle disharmony that no sensor could detect because the sensors themselves were part of the discordant symphony. Her methodical, almost reverent process continued. She moved from the gear bay to the engine housing, her fingers tracing the braided steel lines that fed the mighty General Electric engine. The mockery from the crew had long since faded, replaced by a grudging, perplexed curiosity. There was a seriousness to her work, an intensity of focus that commanded a strange sort of respect. She moved like a surgeon examining a patient, not a mechanic banging on a stubborn machine. On the balcony, Commander Wallace leaned forward, his elbows resting on the railing. He had seen maintainers work for 30 years. He'd seen the hotshots, the veterans, the geniuses, and the plotters. He had never seen anyone work like this. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. It was pure, instinctual diagnosis, an art form he thought had died with the last generation of mechanics who had learned their trade on jets without integrated circuits. He found himself holding his breath, a silent participant in the strange drama unfolding below. As her hand rested on the primary hydraulic manifold block, a dense, complex cube of machined aluminum located deep within the airframe, the world around Eli dissolved. The harsh hangar lights morphed into the frantic, pulsing red of emergency strobes. The scent of ozone and hydraulic fluid was suddenly thick with the acrid smell of burning electronics and cordite. The silence of the hangar was replaced by the deafening roar of wind tearing through a hole in a fuselage, and the rhythmic, terrifying thump-thump-thump of a damaged helicopter rotor blade struggling to keep them in the sky. She was 22 again, a crew chief in a unit whose name was never spoken, whose missions never officially happened. They were over a jagged, moonlit mountain range deep in enemy territory, their MH-60 Black Hawk crippled by enemy fire. The pilot, a man whose face she could still see with perfect clarity, was fighting the controls, his voice strained over the intercom. "Eli, I've got nothing. Cyclic's gone, it's a complete hydraulic failure." Below them, the darkness was alive with hostile forces. They were a falling star, seconds from becoming a crater. Panic was a luxury they couldn't afford. While others braced for impact, she had unstrapped and crawled into the main cabin's maintenance bay, a space barely large enough for a person to fit. With only the light from her headlamp and the violent bucking of the dying bird, she saw the problem. A 762mm round had pierced the primary hydraulic reservoir, but worse, it had shattered a bypass valve, creating a feedback loop that had instantly drained the system's pressure. There was no manual, no procedure for this. There was only the feel of the machine. Her fingers, slick with her own blood from a shrapnel wound she hadn't even registered, found the sheared valve. She could feel the ghost pressures, the violent, uncontrolled shunting of the last dregs of fluid. With a multi-tool and a length of commo wire she ripped from a bulkhead, she bypassed the bypass. She manually jammed the actuator for the tail rotor in place, then used the wire to create a new, crude circuit, forcing the remaining fluid to where it was needed most. It was an ugly, impossible fix, a blasphemy against every rule of aeronautical engineering. And it worked. The shuddering lessened. The pilot's voice came back over the intercom, tight with disbelief. I have partial control. Eli, what did you do?" She had slumped back against the bulkhead, her body screaming with pain and adrenaline, and whispered. I listened. A subtle click brought her back to the present. It was the sound of her thumbnail tapping against the very same model of pressure regulator valve that had failed in that Black Hawk a lifetime ago. It was a newer version, integrated into the F-16's far more complex system, but the soul of the component was the same. Her eyes snapped open. She saw it now. The problem wasn't in the electronics. It wasn't in the main actuators. It was here. A tiny, almost imperceptible flaw in this one valve, a component buried so deep and considered so reliable that the digital diagnostics weren't even programmed to scrutinize it properly. The failure it was causing was intermittent, a feedback pulse so brief that the main computer was misinterpreting it as a catastrophic failure in a dozen other systems. The crew had been chasing ghosts, phantoms created by this one tiny, failing part. She stood up, her movements now filled with a new and startling crispness. The analytical calm was gone, replaced by the focused urgency of a problem solved. "I need a 5mm hex key," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "And a calibrated torque wrench set to 22 inch-pounds. Exactly, the specificity of the request was jarring. Not a wrench, but a specific tool set to a precise, non-standard value. Lieutenant Davies stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. "A torque wrench? For what?" "That's a sealed regulator block. It's not sealed if you know how to open it," she replied without looking at him. Her gaze was fixed on the access panel. "Get me the tools." There was a new steel in her voice. The quiet contractor was gone. In her place was someone used to giving commands and having them followed without question. For the first time, Davies seemed truly unnerved. He hesitated, but one of the younger airmen, a kid named Peterson who had been watching Eli with a growing sense of awe, didn't wait for his officer's permission. He sprinted to the main tool crib. He returned moments later, holding the requested tools out to her like an offering. The hangar was now so quiet you could hear the distant hum of the ventilation system. Every eye was on Eli. On the balcony, Commander Wallace leaned even further over the rail, his knuckles white. He recognized the tone in her voice. It was the sound of absolute certainty. It was the sound of command. Eli took the tools from Airman Peterson with a brief, appreciative nod. She didn't offer a word of explanation to the gawking crew. Words were unnecessary now. Action was the only language that mattered. She lay on her back on a creeper and slid under the fuselage, disappearing into the dark, cramped space of the gear well. The crew crowded as close as they dared, craning their necks to see. All they could see were her legs and the occasional glint of the tools in her hands. Inside the well, Eli worked with a speed and precision that was mesmerizing. Her world narrowed to a single focal point, the regulator block. Her fingers found the 4 tiny hex screws holding the service plate, screws the maintenance manual insisted were factory set and not to be field adjusted. She ignored the warning. The screws resisted for a moment, then gave way with a tiny groan of protest. With the plate removed, the delicate inner workings of the valve were exposed, a series of tiny springs, diaphragms, and a minuscule ball bearing. To the untrained eye, it was perfect. But Eli wasn't looking. She was feeling. She gently probed the main spring with the tip of the hex key. There it was. A minute hesitation, a fractional catch in the compression. A microscopic manufacturing flaw, probably undetectable by any quality control scan, that after thousands of hours of vibration and pressure cycles, had created a stress point. Under specific G-loads and hydraulic pressures, the exact conditions the pilot had reported before the errors began, the spring would resonate, sending a harmonic shudder back through the entire system. It was the aeronautical equivalent of a butterfly's wing causing a hurricane. She didn't replace the spring. She didn't have a spare, and even if she did, it would take hours. Instead, she adjusted it. Using the tip of the key, she gave the spring's housing a minute turn, not more than a few degrees, shifting the tension point. Then, she took the torque wrench. The 22 inch-pound setting was critical. It was a value she remembered from that night in the Black Hawk, the precise torque needed to seat a similar component without crushing its delicate seals. She carefully tightened the service plate screws in a cross pattern. Click. 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 The wrench signaled the exact pressure had been reached. It was done. She slid out from under the aircraft, her face smudged with grease but her eyes clear and bright. She placed the tools carefully on the tool cart. She looked at Lieutenant Davies, whose face was a pale mask of confusion and dawning dread. "Try it now," she said. The command hung in the air, simple and absolute. It was not a suggestion. It was an instruction. Davies, looking flustered and stripped of his authority in front of his crew and his commanding officer, could only nod mutely. He gestured to the airmen already strapped into the cockpit for the endless diagnostic runs. "Power up the APU. Let's see what we've got." The airman's voice crackled over the small speaker on the comms cart. "Yes, sir. Auxiliary power unit start." A low whine began to build from the rear of the F-16, a familiar sound that had, for 3 days, been the prelude to failure. The crew tensed. On the balcony, Commander Wallace held his breath. The whine grew into a steady, high-pitched hum. The lights in the cockpit flickered to life. On the bank of diagnostic monitors next to the tool cart, the screen lit up. For 72 hours, that screen had instantly bloomed into a sea of red error codes and critical failure warnings. But now, it remained blank for a second. Then, one by one, lines of green text began to scroll up the display. Flight control computer, nominal. Hydraulic system pressure, nominal. Primary actuators, nominal. Fly-by-wire integrity, nominal. Green. All green. A collective gasp went through the crew. It was impossible. Airman Peterson stared at the screen, then at Eli, then back at the screen, his mouth hanging open. Davies's face went from pale to ashen. This wasn't just a fix, it was an indictment of his entire method. Eli simply stood there, watching the jet, not the men. She knew what would happen next. "Main engine start," she said quietly, her voice almost drowned out by the APU. The pilot in the cockpit heard her over the comm. He looked to Davies for confirmation. The lieutenant, looking utterly defeated, just gave a weak, jerky nod. "You heard her," he mumbled. "Start the engine." The pilot initiated the start sequence. The JFS, jet fuel starter, screamed to life, and then, with a deep, resonant humph, the F-16's engine ignited. It wasn't the sputtering, hesitant cough of a sick machine. It was a roar. A clean, sharp, deafening blast of power that shook the very concrete of the hangar floor. The sound of a healthy, living fighter jet. It was a sound of resurrection. The force of it washed over the crew, a physical wave of noise and vibration that seemed to scour away the last 3 days of failure and frustration. The jet was alive. It was whole. The impossible problem was gone. In the thunderous aftermath of the engine's roar, a profound silence descended upon the maintenance crew. It was a silence born of pure, unadulterated shock. They stared, not at the jet anymore, but at the woman who stood beside it. The mockery, the condescension, the arrogant certainty they had worn like a uniform, it had all been stripped away, incinerated in the blast of the afterburner. In its place was a humbling, mystified awe. Lieutenant Davies looked as though he had been physically struck. His face, which had cycled through arrogance and frustration, was now a hollow mask of humiliation. He had been so sure, so dismissively certain of her failure. And now, his entire world of digital precision and by-the-book procedure had been undone by a woman with a wrench and an intuition that bordered on supernatural. He had held the keys to the kingdom and couldn't find the lock. She had walked in from the street and simply opened the door. Down from the command balcony, 2 steps at a time, came Commander Wallace. His face was a thundercloud of concentration, his mind racing to process what he had just witnessed. He had seen veteran crew chiefs with a feel for their aircraft, old-timers who could diagnose an engine by its sound, but this was of a different order entirely. This wasn't experience. It was something deeper, something forged in a fire he couldn't begin to imagine. He strode across the hangar floor, his polished boots echoing in the sudden quiet. The crew parted before him like the Red Sea. He ignored them. He ignored Lieutenant Davies, who flinched as he passed. His eyes were locked on only one person. He stopped a few feet from Eli, his gaze sweeping over her. He saw the grease smudge on her cheek, the calm, steady look in her eyes, the way she stood with an unshakable center of gravity. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't gloating. She simply looked satisfied. Like a shepherd who had found a lost lamb. "I don't know who you are," Wallace began, his voice low and intense, a stark contrast to his earlier booming commands. "But I've never seen anything like that. You didn't just fix a machine. You diagnosed its soul." He took a half-step closer, his analytical mind still trying to find a logical container for the event. Protocol demanded he ask for her name, her credentials, her background. But something stopped him. His eyes were drawn to a small, almost unnoticeable detail on her worn jacket. Just beneath the frayed edge of her collar, pinned to the thick canvas, was a small, tarnished silver device. It was no bigger than a thumbnail, deliberately unobtrusive, designed not to be seen. It was not a standard-issue military pin or a civilian contractor badge. It was something else. Wallace's eyes narrowed, focusing on the shape. It was a stylized bird, its wings swept back in a silent, predatory stoop. It had no face, no features. It was a phantom, a ghost rendered in metal. And in its claws, it held a single, broken chain link. Commander Wallace froze. Every drop of blood seemed to drain from his face. The air caught in his throat. He had heard whispers of that symbol. Not in official briefings or personnel files, but in hushed, late-night conversations in secure briefing rooms, told by old intelligence officers and grizzled special operators. They were ghost stories, military myths about a unit that didn't exist, a black ops aviation squadron that handled missions so sensitive, so dangerous, that they were permanently deniable. They were called the Ghost Squadron. They were the pilots and crew who flew into the dark and did the impossible, their only record the silent success of their missions. Their symbol was the Phantom Raptor. He looked from the tarnished pin back to her face, and suddenly, everything clicked into place with the force of a physical revelation. The unnatural calm under pressure. The instinctual, tactile diagnosis. The impossible, on-the-fly repair. The quiet authority that superseded rank. This wasn't just a former mechanic. This was one of them. She was a ghost, walking in the daylight. The legends were real. He understood now that he wasn't looking at a contractor who got lucky. He was looking at a living piece of history, a woman who had operated at a level of skill and under a degree of pressure that Lieutenant Davies and his crew of bright, young technicians could not even comprehend. The mockery they had shown her wasn't just unprofessional, it was sacrilege. Commander Wallace slowly, deliberately, came to the position of attention. It was a gesture of profound respect, an acknowledgement that transcended the visible ranks on their shoulders. He was a colonel, and she was a civilian, but in that moment, he knew who held the higher ground. He didn't ask her name. He didn't need to. In the silent, hallowed space of Hangar 4, beside the resurrected roar of Viper 7, he looked at the quiet woman with the ghost on her collar and spoke, his voice filled with a reverence that stunned everyone present. "Ma'am," he said, and this time, the word was not an insult. It was a title. "Thank you for your service,"